Hello, everybody. It is such a humbling honor to be here with you today, and I need to start by saying that I have somewhat avoided talking about 9/11 for most of the last 20 years because it's difficult and because it's hard to center yourself in something that was so powerful for so many people. But having this invitation to share this with all of you is extraordinary, and being in a room with more than 800 other people for the first time in 2 years is also extraordinary, and what a beautiful thing this is. So I'll begin. On the night of September 12th, 2001, I found myself in the back of a dark delivery truck with my best friend, Haley, and my one-day soon-to-be sister-in-law, Tessa, driving through checkpoints on our way to Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. After what seemed like an endless, bumpy drive through largely deserted streets, the truck stopped and the back doors opened. My friends and I stepped out into an unimaginable scene. There were huge, bright lights trained in haphazard angles to try to light all of the darkness. There were giant sounds of wrenching metal, men covered in white dust going in every direction, a barricade behind which looked like a dozen earth-moving machines and tractors where men were just milling around them, pallet after pallet of stacked supplies, bottled water, snacks, first aid, with no discernible organization. Amidst all this chaos, my friends and I stood there and looked out at it, and I said to myself mostly, who's in charge here? And my friend Tessa looked out at the madness, looked back at me, and said, you are. It was a strange journey that brought me to that moment, steps away from where the Twin Towers had once stood. I'd been living in New York for about a year. When I first did so, I moved with only a handful of friends, no job, and no place to live. My brothers, Sean and Ian, two of my four brothers in this picture, moved there just months before, and they were hardly more established than I was. I quickly found a job waiting tables because I was an actor, and that's where those of us in that business always found our place. And some evenings I went to work not knowing on whose couch I was going to crash that night. After a couple of months of couch surfing, I bought a nice sweater and maybe falsified some income statements and showed up for a showing for an absolute dump of an apartment in the East Village on Avenue B and 4th Street. I said I was a studio singer, true, and that I made $1 gajillion, not true, and hoped that the sweater casually draped over my shoulders and my false bravado would sell me to the slumlord who was sizing up about 24 prospects and who required all applicants, even for that apartment, to make $1 gajillion. I was first in line, he chose me, and that is how I scored the nastiest, loudest, tiniest, most exciting home I've ever had. A month later, my best friend Haley joined me. We didn't have any furniture, but the movers who had brought my few boxes from Los Angeles a week earlier had left a bunch of moving blankets. So I built what I called her a princess in the pea bed for my friend in her minuscule bedroom made out of a dozen folded blankets and welcomed her to our new home with nothing but a jar of flowers in the one room that served as kitchen, living room, dining room, and every other room. So I should take a moment to orient you to New York City as it's important for this story. Haley and I lived in the East Village, marked by the very fancy red arrow I managed to put on this map, on Avenue B and 4th Street. Now, the East Village extends up to 14th Street and over to Broadway, which is where the West Village starts, and which also extends up to 14th Street. Above 14th Street is Union Square, Midtown, and the Upper East and West Sides, and a bunch of other neighborhoods. And below 14th Streets were the villages, East and West, downtown, and the financial district, where the Twin Towers once stood. Very different people, it seemed, lived in these very different areas of Manhattan, and me, Haley, and my brothers were all definite Lower Manhattanites, whatever that meant. We fell hard in love with New York. Before I moved there, when I was visiting my brothers, I was at a gathering at a beer garden in Queens. One of my brother Ian's best friends was trying to enlighten me about what it was like to live in New York. Just getting through the day isn't an accomplishment, he said, and I understood. navigating the masses of people, the subways, knowing which cross streets to avoid when it was windy because of the massive gusts, and which cross streets to avoid because of the smell. Finding our way through the labyrinth that is the West Village to find that unbelievable underground pastry shop. Exploring the churches, so beautiful they shatter you when you walk by. Knowing that you could take the bus, but it would be faster to walk. Embracing the very air, the ground is electric. Everything there is always on in that city. When you land there, you either belong and fall hard into passionate love for the city, or you fall hard and you literally bounce back as if you've just landed on a taut trampoline. Some friends moved there and left within weeks. Other friends moved there and were joyfully subsumed. We were subsumed. We fell hard. The city became ours, and we belonged to the city. I had never loved a place like I loved New York, and perhaps I haven't loved anywhere as much since. I've lived all over the country and beyond, but never felt completely like I belonged anywhere else. I was born in Iowa, but that was happenstance. My father was a symphony conductor, my mother a composer, and they had moved from California a few years before when my father accepted the job as a conductor of the Cedar Rapids Symphony. 4 years later, we moved to London as my father was guest conducting the London Symphony Orchestra. My mother, wherever we were, wrote music. She wrote music regardless of whatever else she was doing. Even when I was very little, I got to know the distracted look on her face. She'd be driving us somewhere, and I'd ask her a question, and she'd not hear me, and I'd come to find out she was working out the voice leading for the oboes in a movement in her latest symphony. Yes, my mom was composing symphonies while driving, while cooking, while doing all the domestic stuff required from a mother of 5 in the 1970s, even though she really should have been in a cabin in the woods composing, or in a 5th-floor elevator building in New York City, which is where she'd be 20 years later. But I digress. I started piano lessons in ballet when I was 5 years old. This is me in the Nutcracker at 6. When I was 8, I was allowed to choose my second instrument. I chose cello. When I was 14, I started playing bass. Also, when I was 14, I figured out I could sing, and that if I was a singer, I didn't have to carry around a cello. So I quit orchestra and turned my attention entirely to musical theater. This is also around the time my family fell apart. My parents spent nearly a quarter of a century together, and though I'm grateful to be here and doubly grateful for my 4 older brothers and this picture from that year, it was not a well-spent quarter of a century. The divorce was ugly, and though some of the details are fuzzy, I know. Sean, who at 2 years older than me was my youngest brothers, and I were the only ones left at home, and the 3 of us, me, Sean, and my mother, had to figure out how to move out of our somewhat palatial house in northern New Jersey, sell our furniture, and find a small apartment because there was no money. I went months without contacting my father or having any contact from him. I know now he didn't know where we were. We had moved to a small town with a great high school. Sean and I fell in with the theater crowd, started a band, and got cast in the fall musical. It was God's spell. I was a freshman, he was a junior. The musical director always held one of the lead spots for a freshman, and I was lucky enough to land that part. And I got cast as Robin, who sings Day by Day. Sean got cast as Judas. Considering our year, it was fitting. The week before we opened, we were doing a run-through when Sean found me backstage and gasped, "Dad's here. He found us." Apparently, he had called all of the schools in New Jersey looking for kids registered under our names and tracked us down. We hadn't seen him in months, and that was both okay and awful. I didn't know what to do, but I did know it was time for my solo. So I went on stage, did my scene, and sang. Day by day, day by day, oh dear Lord, 3 things I pray. to see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly, day by day. After, I went to meet my father, who was in the audience in the back of the auditorium. He was crying. He was so proud. This man, who has always been impossible to please, had been moved by seeing me on stage. I'd like to think that that moment did not set my career goals in motion. I'd like to think that I wrote my own story, followed my own passions, but sometimes major events chart new courses, and this was a major event. I became a performer. We moved to California a year later. I was choir president in high school and senior soloist. I won competitions and awards. I took voice lessons in Hollywood and tap dance lessons in Pasadena. When our choir director had a heart attack the second semester of my senior year, I put together our choir spring show, leading everything from music direction to the fundraising campaign needed for all of our costumes and props. I had decided two things. One, my life was not gonna be a hot mess. And two, I was gonna be a performer. For my first 2 years of college, I went to Citrus College in Glendora, California, where as part of Citrus Singers, I spent 2 years learning how to be a triple threat. That's a singer, dancer, and actor, for those of you not in the biz, and traveling California, the Hawaiian Islands, and Eastern Europe. I wore sequins. I wore choir robes. I then went to 2 other colleges in 2 other states and finally graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Musical Theater. The next years are a blur. A wonderful year in Chicago, originating new musicals, roles in new musicals that never went anywhere but that were great fun. A children's theater tour of the Midwest where we actors cut most of the terrible dialogue and replaced it with a bunch of chase scenes for the delight of grade schoolers across Missouri. 2 summers doing wonderful repertory theater summer stock in northwestern Nebraska. A couple of years in Kansas City doing avant-garde musical theater before moving to Los Angeles and losing my soul for a couple of years. I know LA can be a magical place for some people. For me, well, I had never been so skinny, so hungry, and so lonely. My 2 youngest brothers, Ian and Sean, were there too, one pitching screenplays, the other a fellow actor, and all of us just trying to survive. I did do one super fun thing there. I was on the TV show Friends for half a season. Mind you, I was only an extra, but it was a steady gig, and I earned more watching that crew of actors than I ever did in acting class. Oh, the stories I could tell you. But what I will tell you is this. Comedy is hard, and those actors worked their tails off. It was in LA, I think, that I started to wonder about my career path. It wasn't what I experienced as the soullessness of the film industry. It was that I suspected I had something different to give. I had talent as a singer, and I was a strong dancer, but truth be told, I wasn't a great actor, and I started to question my commitment to this brutal industry. Was this what I wanted to do with my precious hours on this earth? After a few years of eking out a living in Los Angeles, Sean and Ian, my brothers, moved to New York. 2 months later, I was there visiting in that Queens Theater Garden, hearing about how just making it through the day in New York wasn't an accomplishment. 3 weeks after that, I moved to New York for good. So back to my friend Haley, the one who slept in the Princess and the Pea bed. She and I found jobs in a French restaurant owned by Egyptian men in the West Village, because New York, and we started auditioning. I did a number of shows with the 24 Hours Plays folks. I was lucky enough to act with my brother Sean in a number of shows that his then fledgling theater company, now a successful media company, produced. I got cast in a staged reading of a play being produced by the Naked Angels, a storied off-Broadway theater company in New York. That staged reading got me an interview with Matt Dillon's agent, who saw me in the show and told me over and over in our meeting, "I just don't know what to do with the likes of you." And I still don't really know what that meant. I went to a zillion cattle call auditions for Broadway shows, where the casting directors always complimented me on my voice and never brought me in for callbacks. In early 2001, I found myself on the stage of the Lyric Theater on West 43rd Street, hoofing with hundreds of other tap dancers as we auditioned for the revival of 42nd Street. The choreographer brought us out on stage, 20 at a time, with the shortest of us, which would be me, front and center. I'll never forget what he said. Look around. Look at where you are. This may be the first and last time you ever dance on a Broadway stage. Dance like it. And we did. And for me, it was indeed the first and last time on a Broadway stage. That may have actually been my last audition for anything. I spent the summer and fall working at a top New York City restaurant, immersing myself in yet another passion, wine and the winemaking regions of the world, and wondering what the heck was next for me. I remember telling Tessa, if you remember my soon not yet to be sister-in-law, that it felt like the tectonic plates of my life were shifting and I didn't know where they were gonna settle. The morning of 9/11, I was awoken by Haley. I'd worked late the night before and I was bleary-eyed and confused and our TV didn't work properly. So she was on the phone with her brother back in Kansas City trying to figure out what was going on. He said that a plane had hit one of the towers. The picture on our TV was fuzzy, but all we had to do was lift our blinds to see smoke billowing out from downtown. This was taken from our apartment. We didn't know what to do. I was supposed to work that day, and not knowing what was actually happening, I figured I should go. Haley grabbed her camera, and we went our separate ways. These are Haley's pictures, and she is now a successful and wonderful professional photographer. I walked across town to get to work, which was about 10 blocks away at Union Square. Two things struck me as I walked. There were far more people on the street than usual, and it was a heartbreakingly perfect, beautiful fall day. The people were on the streets because the subways weren't working. I was halfway to work trying to avoid this billowing smoke when someone started screaming. They had a portable radio and said the second tower had been hit. That was when we all knew something was terribly, terribly wrong, not tragic, not a freak mistake, but an act so awful that none of us could comprehend it. I stumbled to work and found only two people there, the general manager and a coworker. The restaurant was dark, and none of us could grasp what was happening. That's when another coworker burst in and said, "It fell. The tower, it fell." And we all went running outside. From Union Square, you could look straight down Broadway and see the towers in Manhattan, in lower Manhattan. That was how all of us New Yorkers oriented ourselves when we came out from the subway. You just look for the towers, that's south. But one was gone, just smoke and billowing ash. And minutes later, we watched the second one crumble. "All those people," said my coworker behind me. "All those people." I can't piece together the next hours. Somehow Haley and I found each other. She'd been taking these pictures, but had to run away when the towers fell because the plume of smoke and ash was so intense. We'd gathered some meager clothing and first aid supplies from our apartment, dropped them by the Salvation Army, and found our way to my brother Ian and Tessa's apartment in the West Village. We watched the throngs of people covered in white dust as they tried to make their way uptown from the wreckage. Ian and Tessa stood outside with their portable landline phone, letting people use it to call their friends and family to check in since all of the towers were down. Later, we sat together dumbstruck for hours, trying to process the images we were seeing on her television and what we were seeing on the street. By the time Haley and I walked home, they had barricaded New York City from 14th Street down, and she and I had the strangest, quietest walk home down the middle of deserted New York City avenues with the World Trade Center missing from our view. The next day, we took action. We walked all over the East Village with a shopping cart donated to us by our closest pharmacy and picked up more donations from every drugstore we stopped in. Clerks loaded us up with bandages, disinfectant, Tylenol. as if any of this could actually help. We headed back to the Salvation Army with a heaping shopping cart full of supplies that would better have helped skin knees at a kid's birthday party than stitch together a giant hole in our city, but it was something. It felt like something. And we'd heard that the Salvation Army was coordinating relief efforts for the search and rescue teams. The Salvation Army's headquarters was on 14th Street, which is again the literal and emotional line between the West Village and East Village and downtown, and the Midtown and Upper Manhattan. Indeed, a friend of mine who lived near me in the East Village used to call anything above 14th Street Canada. I don't know why the police and FEMA had hemmed in Lower Manhattan right there, but 14th Street was the line, and so if you crossed 14th and went to Canada, you had to prove that you were a resident of Lower Manhattan or you couldn't get back in. But we had got a cart full of supplies, and we'd figured we'd talk our way back through the barricade at some point, because what New Yorker actually has a New York driver's license to show proof of residency? We didn't drive. So we went ahead and headed to the Salvation Army. Tessa met us there with her own donated supplies, and the three of us got to work. It was total chaos. People had brought anything they felt might be useful: clothing, first aid, food, but it wasn't yet clear exactly what was needed, and the piles of donations kept growing. We tasked ourselves with organizing the suppliers and sometimes organizing the organizers. I befriended a harried Salvation Army major simply by staying quietly close by and offering to help coordinate various tasks. And then he came over to me and said in a low voice, "We've got a truck going down to provide support to the teams working at the pit." The pit was what they called the hole. He said, "We have to be quiet about it, because if people find out we're going down and find out they can't go, they will riot." And it was true. All of us were desperate to be helpful. All of us were desperate to do something to heal the literal and emotional wound our city had suffered the day before. The major told me where to wait. I went over and took the hands of my friends, Haley and Tessa, and had them come wait with me. The major found us, we stepped into the back of the delivery truck, and we were off. The Salvation Army was one of many organizations working on search and rescue, and our van was waved through the first big checkpoint on 14th Street and every subsequent stop. In the back of the van, in the dark and the quiet, we could hear the conversations drifting in from the cab of the truck at every checkpoint, but we couldn't see or hear anything else. When we got to ground zero, we stepped out into chaos. We were in a giant parking lot, or maybe it was the crossroads of a street. It was impossible to tell. There were the huge bright lights and the workers going in every direction, the dozens of earth mover machines with men milling around them, and pallet after pallet of supplies: water, snacks, first aid, clothes, gloves. Tessa, Haley, and I stood there for a moment, and I can't explain it, but we all seemed called in different directions in the chaos. The only thing that was clear was that everyone here was still operating in frantic rescue mode, not organized recovery mode. And the three of us would be more useful divided than together. And it was then that I said, "Who's in charge here?" And Tessa said, "You are." And then she and Haley disappeared into the madness. This was a pivotal moment in my life, and I share it with you now and all of this backstory in hopes that perhaps for all of you, it doesn't take a lifetime of searching and traveling and failing and questioning to realize that you have the power to take action at any moment without anyone's permission. Now, I highly recommend the searching and traveling and even the failing and questioning, because that is the richness of life. But I think in that moment, it took explicit permission for me to realize that I was capable, I was skilled, I was smart, I was enough to go figure out how to make a difference. What I quickly found out as I wandered the perimeter of the pit was that many groups and individuals who were down there were not in proper communication with each other. Supply pallets towered so high in one area that the men who desperately needed work gloves didn't realize there were hundreds of them stacked just 10 feet away. There were great stacks of water and food, but the men working at the pit absolutely refused to leave their post to go retrieve it, because they were certain if they were able to lift just one more steel beam, they'd find a survivor. People had driven their tractors and earth-moving machines from New Jersey and Connecticut and much further afield, but it wasn't clear how they could be useful. So there were just dozens of these machines and their operators just looking helplessly on. And I watched, terrified, as men working on one high section of the pit hauled a bunch of metal and tossed it over the side, only to have that metal land on the top of a pile where other men were digging, narrowly avoiding crushing the men on the lower section. It was a scene in desperate need of coordination and communication, but desperation was the key driver here. These men had been here for 24 hours straight, and none could stop to think. But I could. I started by designating people in each section of supplies to talk to each other about what they had and where it needed to go. I talked to the nearby cops and asked them to help the groups of men in front of us coordinate their efforts, since I didn't have the authority to actually climb up onto the piles of steel. And I grabbed 2 buckets and filled them with bottles of water and stepped out of the perimeter and into the fray of the rescue. I stopped every man, offered them a bottle of water, a smile, and a thank you. This is part of the story included in the 110 Stories play. Not every man accepted the water, but every one of them thanked me and held my eyes a bit and then continued their work. I'm going to return to the words I wrote 20 years ago to describe what happened that night after I found my way to one of the structures still standing near the pit that had been repurposed into a coordination station. I saw my first body. When I walked into our main staging area, there were 3 signs: hot food, medical, morgue, all pointing in the same direction. Not an hour later, I'm pouring sugar into a fireman's coffee and someone yells, "Hats off!" and everyone bows their heads. There in front of me is a body, but not really, just parts, in a bag, on a gurney carried by 6 firefighters. Then 2 chaplains say a prayer, and it's carried away. I realized these 2 chaplains hadn't moved since I'd arrived, and that they were there to bless body after body. I don't know how many times I heard hats off. I don't know how many times I've been thanked in the last 2 days. I reached a point tonight when I simply stopped, walked out, looked over the rubble and all these men, all of my men, and turned north and headed home. I have to tell you how amazing the people are down there, the construction workers, the firefighters, the cops. They are unflagging, they are kind, beautiful, incredible. This is all about them now, in my mind, since I tell you right now, there will be no more survivors. At that time, it was still being called a rescue operation, but anyone who was down there at that point knew it was really recovery. Either you made it out of the towers or you didn't. We weren't ready to tell the world that yet, though, and we all worked desperately trying to disprove what we already knew. The last line that I wrote that was included in the play set the stage for the changes about to happen in my personal and professional life. I wrote, "While I can't say I enjoyed volunteering, I'd never felt more useful in my entire life." And this came to define me, as it does to this day. All I really want is to be useful. All I really want is for what gifts I have to be employed to work to my best and highest ability. I decided that day that the next time I was needed in any kind of crisis or emergency, I would be better prepared. I wanted to be able to do more than pour coffee for a firefighter. I wanted to be able to fight the fires myself, whatever form they took. I volunteered at Ground Zero and at nearby supply warehouses for months. A few months later, I enrolled at John Jay College in New York City to become an emergency medical technician. It was a grueling course which required incredible emotional and physical strength and stamina, and I was one of only 3 women who passed the course. I also got a second job, I was still waiting tables, working as a disaster relief coordinator for the American Red Cross in New York City. I still have the cover letter I wrote to the Red Cross when I was applying for the job. "I'm young, healthy, and strong," I wrote, "and I'm going to work in disaster relief, and I'd like it to be with you." The man who eventually hired me called me laughing over my letter saying, "You are a nut. Can you come in for an interview tomorrow?" So 5 evenings a week, I waited tables, 2 evenings a week, I went to class, and 3 days a week, I responded to emergencies in my city. It was an intense time, but goodness, for the first time in my life, I had such purpose. I graduated from the EMT course in May of 2002 and spent the summer as a medic on a public lands trek sponsored by National Geographic. For 4 months, I took care of a team of trekkers as we hiked, biked, horsebacked, canoed, and ATV'd across the American West as we worked to highlight America's public lands. But I still hadn't found my fit. Those tectonic plates of my life were still shifting, and I felt restless and unfulfilled. I moved back to California, Northern California this time, staying with my father in Napa Valley. I almost joined the Peace Corps. I got a job selling wine instead. As I say, I was lost. And then I got the most extraordinary opportunity. The local Arts Council, which is a countywide organization that oversees and organizes creative efforts in a region, was struggling and in need of spunky and, gratefully, in my case, inexperienced and willing to work for almost nothing, leadership. And that is where I found my sea legs. Working in the arts in California in the early 2000s was pretty much like working in disaster relief, I liked to say. We were last in the nation for per capita public funding for the arts. A tax law had decimated arts education in K-12 schools, and although we had Hollywood and the whole film industry, the other creative arts were often seen as window dressing, particularly in wine country. Here was a challenge worthy of my time, and I could even perform to raise money for the cause. I made so many mistakes. I was so green. I made a practice out of making a fool of myself. But I also had great teachers and mentors. I was chosen for a young leadership development program that absolutely changed my life. I found coaches who helped me battle the dragons that roared both in my own mind and in my professional day-to-day. I learned how to navigate the older male power structures in my county without sacrificing my sense of self. I was the CEO of that arts council for 5 years, and it was better than any MBA I could have gotten. I tripled our budget, created the first public arts policy, created the first public funding stream for the arts, and was named Nonprofit Employee of the Year, and launched that organization into a new era of strength and effectiveness that continues to this day. And I kept my commitment to disaster relief. I volunteered for the local Red Cross chapter, and after Hurricane Katrina in the fall of 2005, I spent 3 weeks in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi doing casework for individuals who lost their homes and possessions in that disaster. And then in 2009, I moved to Santa Cruz, California, where I spent 10 years as the CEO of their Arts Council. We created programs that paired artists with community and civic leaders, and together we tackled the county's pressing issues: climate change, conservation, public safety, economic development, people experiencing homelessness, food insecurity, equitable education. We used murals, music, and poetry to help find creative solutions to problems, and it worked. It was there in Santa Cruz, finally, that I truly figured out what I was going to be when I grew up, for a time. It was there that I figured out how to blend my passion for doing good in the world with my background in the arts. It was there that I learned the name for what I'd always wanted to work toward: social justice. It was there that I learned how to name what I wanted to build: a life of service. And it was there that I learned what kind of leader I really wanted to be: one who embraced humility, who owned my mistakes, who stood up and spoke out for others and lifted up the people around me to the best of my ability. I still made so many mistakes. I still do. But the practice is to sit with the mistakes, make reparations, practice self-forgiveness, and do better. 2 years ago, my husband got offered his dream job in Tampa, Florida. He'd moved twice for my career, once to join me in Napa and again to Santa Cruz, and it was my turn to make the same choice for him. So we picked up our little family, we have 2 boys, aged 8 and 10, and made the move across the country. A year ago, I accepted a job working with a dear friend at an organization called the Semi Foundation. We are the nonprofit arm of a global organization that provides services and standards for the microelectronics industry, meaning the microchip industry. Our organization works to move underrepresented people, women, people of color, veterans, differently abled, into good jobs in the tech industry. And we work to transform tech companies into workplaces that are more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. It's a far cry from the arts. And the only singing I do now is at bedtime for my kiddos. But I get to work every day to bring economic opportunity to people all over the world who otherwise might not have it, and that helps me sleep at night. So what does a life of service mean to me, both in my personal life and in my professional life? It's not just about volunteering or donating. It's about daily practice. So here's what I try to practice. Hire wonderful, smart, committed people and then get out of their way and allow them to do great work. Celebrate the accomplishments of people around you and never take credit for work that isn't yours. Challenge the power structures that dictate our lives and understand that there is a lot of luck and happenstance that led you to be in charge of a situation. Work on actively learning from the people you manage and lead. Never fall into the false belief that you've accomplished anything great entirely on your own. It is so rarely possible. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. At the same time, own your gifts and your strengths. Play to them and surround yourself with others who know things you don't, who are better at other things, and who will challenge you when you are wrong and support you when you're on target. Be the first one to act. If you see an injustice, be the first to speak up. If you see a problem, be the first to offer solutions. By doing so, you will give others courage and the will to act. If the front door is closed, find the side door. This is what I learned most working with artists for so long. When you're dealing with a sensitive or political or challenging issue, don't slam it head on. Look at all the sides, all the options. Find a different way to explore the issue and talk about it. Bring the creative process of discovery to every challenge you meet, and I promise you will find a way through. Challenge your own ego, examine your motivations. I was a CEO for 15 years, and now I am just a deputy director, third in line from the top. This has been a humbling practice, but also an intentional one. I took a step back because I wanted more time and energy to be with my kids, but I also wanted to examine myself as a leader by watching others. And 1 year in, I've learned so much, again, about how I do and do not want to lead when I again pick up the CEO mantle. We are all always a work in progress, and I encourage you to never stop learning about and exploring who you want to be in the world. Practice insatiable curiosity about the world, about your friends, about strangers. Show up. Show up for your friends, literally and metaphorically. Practice generosity of spirit. When you are listening, really listen. Don't just wait for your turn to speak. I think I was in my 40s before that one really landed. And remember that the smallest acts of thoughtfulness can shift a terrible day or event. And finally, I'll share with you what I'm always telling my kids. Besides the fact that they are tremendously privileged and must be social justice warriors and that most of their diets should be vegetables. You can imagine how that one goes over. I tell them there are only two paths to happiness: gratitude and acts of kindness. When they are feeling down with 8-year-old woes or 10-year-old preteen angst, I remind them, make a list of what you are grateful for. Tell me 5 things right now. I remind them, who can you show love in this moment? Who needs an act of kindness? It can be a hug for your brother or an email to grandma. Gratitude and acts of kindness, I found, are the only avenues toward happiness, joy, and peace. At my heart, I will always be a creative person, a singer, actor, dancer, writer, and storyteller. I know that everything I've done, from acting to working in restaurants to disaster relief to emergency medicine and everything in between, has been worthwhile in my journey to living a meaningful life, a life of service. If my story proves anything, is that life is not necessarily linear. Career paths do not need to be linear. But the key is to listen to what your heart is telling you, to listen to the calling or callings that you hear. Ask for help where you want to go. And most importantly, offer help to those around you to help them answer their callings. It feels like the world has changed a lot since 9/11, or maybe it's me. But the events of that day and its aftermath allowed me to find a path to who I wanted to be in the world. I am not glad that 9/11 happened, but I'm grateful for what I learned as a result. Given how hard everything is now, how scary COVID is, how disconnected the last 2 years have felt, how brutally politicized public health has become, how relationships between family members and friends are being strained due to different belief systems, and climate change in Afghanistan, and I bring us back to gratitude and acts of kindness. Your generation, you and my kids, have the opportunity to do this world differently. And I implore you to start with taking care of each other. That is the heart of a life of service. If you are wondering who is in charge of making this happen, let me remind you, you are. Practice compassion, practice forgiveness, and practice love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So when we have a convocation with a speaker, like those of you who were at our diversity dialogue the other day know, we'd like to take some time to invite follow-up questions and participation by any of you. The way that we do this, we have 2 mics you see up here in the front corners on the floor. We've got a little bit of time. So I'd invite anyone who has a question for Michelle, a follow-up question, to make your way down to either of those 2 mics. If we get several people, we can form a little line behind each one. We probably won't have time for everybody, but if you're interested in asking a question, come on down to a mic and we'll trade off who asks. You first? Make sure that mic works, Javon. Go like this.
Hello.
There it is. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Javon.
Hi.
What were the people, the society like during 9/11, like in the streets?
That's a great question. It was extraordinary. People, you've never seen the divisions between people just drop. Everyone was helping everyone. It was just the most incredible sense of camaraderie and compassion and love, and people were handing other people their shoes, because there was a lot of people who were coming from their workplaces and were trying to walk all the way uptown in heels, and so women were taking off their running shoes and handing them to other women. It was just this most extraordinary time of people holding on to each other and helping each other. And my mother was in Poland when 9/11 happened. She was a judge for a music competition, and everyone she met when they found out she was an American held her, like literally offered themselves to her. So it wasn't even just in New York, but it was just this really amazing, and it lasted for weeks, and it taught me what we as humans are capable of more so than anything else I've ever seen.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Max, and my
Hi, Max.
question is, what was going through your mind when you heard that the first plane had hit?
When the first plane hit, I think for all of us, it was just confusion. We all thought it must have been a mistake. I think everyone thought that something awful had happened, but no one understood that it was intentional. It wasn't until the second plane hit that it really started to come home for all of us that this was intentional. So that first one, it was terror and it was sadness, but it wasn't, it was mostly just bewilderment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. So, like, if you dedicated your life to, like, volunteering afterwards, but, like, do you think you would have continued to do it if 9/11 never happened?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So, like, would you have volunteered, like, and dedicated your life to doing all the things you did if 9/11 never happened? Like, do you think you would
Do you
have...
think I would have volunteered or had the life I had in 9/11 not happened?
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, it's a question. I think that's a really good question. I knew that I had a higher calling, but I didn't know how to find it. My guess is I would have found it by, somehow, but there was something about witnessing. It actually goes back to the first question of what people were capable of being for one another, and that's the space I wanted to inhabit all the time, not just after a crisis. So, I still was pretty lost for many years immediately after, but at least I had a North Star. Do you know what I mean? If I didn't know the pathway there. So I like to think so, but who knows?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Will, and I was wondering, for the play 110 Stories, what was it like hearing that you might be in a character in it and have the chance to share your story in that manner?
So the development of the play was wild. Sarah Toft, who's the playwright, she and I were friends and in the same downtown New York City theater circles, and actually my brother's theater company first produced 110 Stories, way back when, sort of helped develop it. So, mostly at that point, and still, it just feels like a tremendous honor that my story would be interesting enough to be included amongst all those other stories, because there were people who made such incredible sacrifices and did so many amazing things and still do. So it's really, really beautiful that 20 years later, this play that's been produced all across the country and raised a lot of money through benefits for the survivors of 9/11, it's extraordinary. And to know that this school's going to be doing it and to be here in person is just, and to meet the woman who's going to be playing me, it's out of body. It's totally wild. It's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about your involvement in performing arts, right? And,
In what? I'm sorry?
Performing arts.
Mm-hmm.
When times got dark during 9/11, did any of that, like the music, did that help you sort of cope with all that happened? How did you cope with what happened?
So if I could say your question back to you, how did being in the arts help cope with what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh, in every way, writing about it, coming home every night after I volunteered, or sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, and that's what, the parts of in the play are pulled from. Writing about it and being a writer and someone who was creative in that way was very helpful, definitely. And also having a sense of community of theater people around us. So my brother's theater company, which I keep on referencing, pulled together 15 other theater companies who all came together to do several weekends of shows. All of those funds went to support the 9/11 workers. And so, I think any community can do that, but there's something about being a creative community saying, well, we have these gifts, we can use them for the greater good, and that definitely helped pull me through and pull all my friends through as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Charlie. So I think a lot of the students can relate to this, but we've been told, the world changed, which is obvious, but can you kind of explain exactly how the world changed, some examples? Because we've all been told that it has, but we never really told how it changed.
Oh, I don't know if we have time. Well, there were the everyday changes and then the global changes. Afghanistan, which 20 years later that right there, that entering into that war was massive and world changing, not just for us, but obviously for Afghans. Even the smallest thing, air travel changed forever. The way we cross borders, changed forever. So it was certainly in my lifetime the event that triggered just so many series of different ways of being. I think, much like the pandemic is now once again rewriting the world, people changed where they lived. One of my brothers, Ian, who was also in New York, had some pretty serious PTSD after 9/11 and what he saw, and he ended up leaving the city, never to live there again. And so, it changed people in personal ways, and then also changed operational ways of our society, and then set a lot of global events in motion.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natalie, and I wanted to ask, after the Twin Towers fell, could you feel like the environment changed, like everyday, traveling and stuff? Could you feel like the environment changing?
Do you mean immediately after?
Yeah, or a week after, could you feel like people traveling to work or walking down the street? Could you feel the vibe change?
Oh yeah, the whole energy of the city was different. Also, so much shut down. Restaurants shut down, Broadway shut down, and people, New York is a city of visitors, right? And people stopped coming. But it was almost, I'll have to akin it to I remember one morning walking home from working at one of the restaurants I worked at 3 a.m. and the streets were quiet in the middle of a snowstorm. And it was one of the only times that New York has ever felt quiet, except for that week after 9/11, when everything was down a pitch because there just weren't as many people there, and also we all felt like we had better access to each other. In New York, you ignore people when they walk by, but not after 9/11. You met everyone's eye, and if someone even stumbled, you went to help them. So it was definitely a powerfully different environment. And it's an environment I wish we could nurture outside of a crisis. I wish we could live in that space every day.
Thank you.
Time for just one more.
Hello, I'm Isabel. So you said that after 9/11, it was kind of all the barriers between people that caused division just dropped. But we have a lot of division today. So what do you think made them go back up? And do you think we can achieve that kind of unity again without a tragedy happening?
Just so I can repeat the question back to you. So you mentioned how the divisions dropped, and you're wondering why and how they came back up and how we can return to that space. Honestly, I think part of it is that it's very easy to be fueled by fear. I think fear is driving every division we're looking at right now, and that as soon as we got over the shock and horror, people were angry and they wanted people to blame. And so the blame cycle started, and people had different feelings about that. And so those divisions started to creep back up. As far as how to get back there, I think, gratitude and acts of kindness. Honestly, I know my kids are so tired of hearing about it, but if you can find that, and if you can find ways to be compassionate and to understand not just that other people have very different opinions and feelings, but why, and to find those side doors in to have conversations about it. I really think, it's not a magic wand, but to me, it's the only thing that's ever worked. So I think releasing blame, I think anger's fine, but it's what we do with it. So, yeah, gratitude and acts of kindness.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Would you say that overall 9/11 brought us closer together or divided us? Did it ever divide us at any point?
You're asking, are you asking if 9/11 divided us or made us closer together?
I feel like at first it brought us all closer together, but then it sort of divided us. Do you think it's safe to say that?
I think it's absolutely to save that. I mean, I think, it's what What part are you thinking about or focusing on any given moment? I've never seen a more tight-knit city of 8 million people than after 9/11, but now, you know, I can also see how things have gotten really fractured. So I don't know, I do wish it didn't take these giant events to bring people together. And I think one of the things that's hard about the pandemic is it's been sustained, and so we're all just so weary, you know, by it all, and that makes it even harder to show compassion and love. But we've got it in us, so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Great questions, everybody. One more round of applause for Michelle Williams-Vaden. Thank you very much.